Modern History at the University of Essex, Kimberley Brownlee, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, and Robert West, Professor of Health Psychology at UCL. And Robert, let's start with you. How significant do you think this is going to be on us as a nation?
Well, I think it already is significant. And I think one of the things that you kind of see in situations like this is there has to be a transition from a sense that everything is normal and you can carry on as usual to, hang on a minute, this is the big one. This is a very serious situation that you have to deal with in a different way.
Kimberley?
I think initially it'll feel like a small change, but we're not used to being in isolation, and we are deeply social creatures. We spend 80% of our waking hours with other people, and psychologists tell us we actually prefer that time to the time we spend alone. So I think the longer it lasts, and it may not just be 2 weeks of isolation, the longer it lasts, the harder we'll feel it.
Lucy, before we get into that loneliness point, I mentioned earlier this idea that the government scientific advisor told Newsnight yesterday that he was comparing this to the Blitz in terms of its impact. What do you think of that as a historian?
Well, it's a very different kind of event, isn't it? I think that in some ways, I can see the point of that comparison. It could be a kind of, I think we can understand it as perhaps as a generational defining event, much like the Blitz for Britain or the Second World War more widely. I think where we are at the moment probably feels more like before, just at the start of the war, that sense that something possibly pretty terrible is about to happen, but we don't quite know what it's going to feel like or what shape it's going to take.
And you talk about loneliness. It's something that, you know, some people in Britain do face, but most of us aren't used to.
So 9 million people in Britain report feeling lonely all the time. In the United States, about 40% of people report that. And amongst older people, that number is much higher. And we're all about to get a bit of a taste of it. And when it becomes chronic...
The impact on those people who are isolating, all those people.
Absolutely, yes, when we isolate. And when loneliness becomes chronic and acute, it's correlated with health risks. Reduced immunity, suicidal thoughts, depression, alcoholism, progression of Alzheimer's, self-harm. It's a threatening experience to feel lonely.
Robert, how do we manage that kind of anxiety? How can we mitigate it?
Well, I think the problem you have is that you get a spread of different reactions. So on the one hand, you've still got complacency. I mean, there's many people I know who say, I don't know what all the fuss is about. And in a way, you can say, OK, they've got a point, because, for example, 200 people a day are dying because of smoking. So that's obviously a huge number. We still have something like 11 deaths, I think, in this country at the moment. So there's the complacency on the one hand. And on the other hand, you've got sort of panic, and we see panic buying and people feeling very anxious about this uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. And what you need to happen, because ultimately what needs to happen is people have to do the things that are going to be necessary to protect themselves and society, is to translate both of those things into concern. And that concern then has to be translated into effective action. We know what we have to do in terms of, hand washing, not touching your face, and so on. But getting that actually embedded and continuing to be embedded for weeks, months, and so on is going to be difficult.
But people do seem to be reacting, don't they? Everything from travelling less on public transport, working more from home. That seems to be happening. Do you think effects like that, if we jump ahead, be positive and think it's going to be over at some point, do you think that effects like that from this virus will stick with us permanently? What does history tell us about that?
I think history tells us it's really hard to predict that kind of thing, and perhaps some of the changes that we might expect now may not be the eventual changes. I mean, I was wondering just now when you were talking about loneliness, whether this might make us actually take loneliness more seriously after more of us have experienced it while we're having to isolate or to self-isolate. But I think my area of expertise, I think some of the long-term changes that came out of the Second World War certainly couldn't have been predicted during the war. Well, for one example, women and women's work and women's role in society. I mean, it's relatively well known that during the Second World War, lots more women go into areas of work that have previously been seen as not as women's work, as men's work. So working in heavy industry, being conscripted into the military. 1945 and the end of the war, that all stops.